Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. It's great to see where everyone is coming from. Wow, lots of people. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Welcome to Lifting Voices. Wow, that's great. Thanks, everyone. So glad to see you all here with us today. This is the April 2022 Lifting Voices episode, Native Voices in YA. We have a great lineup of panelists today. I'm just really excited to get this conversation started, so let's go. Lifting Voices was created and is organized by Mackin Educational Resources. Mackin is a family-owned, Minnesota-based company with nearly 40 years of service to the educational community. Mackin provides print and digital books for students around the world in their libraries and in their classrooms. Mackin Via, our free digital content management system, is accessed by over 9 million students worldwide. Mackin also has a makerspace division, a professional learning division, and our newest edition, Access It Library, which is an incredible library management system, and you can learn more about all of this on mackin.com. If you are new to our program, you should know that the goal of Lifting Voices is to provide a platform for underrepresented voices to share their unique stories and perspectives and to celebrate their success and their contributions. If you are new, I encourage you to go back and watch our previous programs. You can find them all on mackin.com. We've had some fabulous conversations with authors, illustrators, and editors. I invite you, as many of you already have done, to use the chat bar for questions and comments you have. There will be lots of time to answer the questions that you have. So feel free to ask questions of the panelists, because we want this program to really be interactive. So feel free to communicate with them and with me. Make sure that you are chatting to everyone, not just panelists, so that we make sure that we see your questions. And we will send a follow-up email that will contain a link to today's program so you can rewatch it, you can share it with colleagues. We'll also include a link for you to purchase all the books that we talk about today. All right, let me introduce our panelists. Eric Gansworth, Saway Nase, is an enrolled Onondaga writer and visual artist from the Tuscarora Nation. His award-winning books include If I Ever Get Out of Here, Give Me Some Truth, Extra Indians, and Apple, Skin to the Core, winner of the Michael L. Printz Honor and the American Indian Youth Literature Award. He is a professor and Lowry Writer in Residence at Canisius College. Welcome, Eric. Andrea L. Rogers is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 2020, she published Mary and the Trail of Tears. Her work has also appeared in U2, 25 Voices Share Their #MeToo stories, Ancestor Approved Intertribal Stories for Kids, and in the anthology Allies. Welcome, Andrea. And Anton Treuer is a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University and an author of 18 books. His equity, education, and cultural work has put him on a path of service around the region, the nation, and the world. His newest book for young people, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, Young Readers Edition, is a recipient of a Golden Kite Award. And our moderator for today, oh, welcome, Anton. And our moderator for today is Nick Thomas. He's the executive editor with Levine Querido. He was previously the senior editor at Arthur A. Levine Books, where he started as an editorial assistant. He also held positions with Bloomsbury, Chicken House, and David Fickling Books before returning to his AALB roots. He edits middle grade and young adult books and looks for stories that change something about you by the time you're finished reading them. So now I will hand it over to Nick to get our conversation started. I encourage you to put questions and comments in the chat. I will collect them and we will ask the panelists at the end of the program. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kia. It's a real pleasure to be here. We love Mackin and love talking to librarians and teachers. So I work for Levine Querido. We're an independent children's book publisher. We've been around just for like 3 years, but it's been a great start so far. And a lot of that has been because of the support of librarians and teachers kind of across the country. So we're really grateful for you guys. And I'm really excited to be here with these 3 authors, all of whom I have the honor of working with and who are really interesting, cool people. So I think it's going to be a fun conversation. So I have questions for each of you specifically, and then a lot of like kind of general questions, but I figured we would just jump in. I'd like all 3 of you to talk about the genesis of your book. So Andrea, Man-Made Monsters, Anton, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, and then Eric, you could pick, either Apple Skin to the Core, or Eric has another fabulous book coming out this fall called My Good Man. But I just want to hear, like, where did these books first start for you guys, and what was the inspiration? Anton, you go first.
Thanks for having me, everybody. I'm really excited to be in this conversation. I came into Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask entirely by accident. I think I had finished high school with a thought that a lot of high schoolers have, which was, I'm going to get out of town and never come back. And nothing like leaving to make me want to come home and never leave. But while I was going to college out at Princeton University, I think I was the first Ojibwe person to go to college there. I had all kinds of experiences, from hilarious and fun to troubling, and realized that the brambled racial borderland of my youth would follow me wherever I went, and that there really wasn't a way away from it, but I'd have to find a way through it. I also came to the realization that, well, I knew what it was like living in this body, being brown and having braids. I guess it's a man bun today. That I could speak to my lived experience, but explaining everything else, still required me to go out searching for answers. And I kind of stumbled into this project, but it was kind of like Forrest Gump when he figured out how to run. After that, every time he went somewhere he was running, he never thought it would take him anywhere. And I kind of felt like that with my quest for answers. I, speak in this one both to my personal experiences and to my professional work. It's pretty wide ranging. And I don't know, what do you think, Nick? Do I got time to share a little story about it, or should I just keep it at that and we'll save the rest for questions?
I think you're done, like, for the rest of the afternoon, honestly. I think no, go for it. Yeah,
so I'll share one real quick one. But at one point I was out at Princeton and getting homesick, and I thought, man, I wonder if there'll be anything native happening out here. And I was looking around, and lo and behold, there was some notice that there was going to be a sweat lodge ceremony somewhere out in the New Jersey woods. And I could be pretty naive, but I was just smart enough to know that they're weirdos and Fruit Loops and people who have culture for sale, and this could be one of them, especially since the officiant was advertised as Comanche. And the Comanche are from Oklahoma and Texas, and what are they doing running ceremonies in New Jersey? But I thought if it's like home, I'll go out there and check it out. And there were two big surprises. So the first was, as I went there about 4 p.m, the sun was up, beautiful day. I would say the first surprise was that everybody there was white. And the second surprise was that everybody there was completely naked. And so as I came up, I have these mixed feelings. Like, part of me wants to laugh because, it's a bunch of naked people standing around in the woods. Part of me wants to run because, dang, it's a bunch of naked people standing around in the woods. Part of me was mad, like, come on, is that what you think we're all about? Get naked, dance around a fire or something, But being naive, I opened the car door. I was immediately folded into a tight embrace by one of these naked strangers who's now hugging me, saying, I'm so sorry what my people did to your people. So awkward. Now the desire to laugh, run, get mad is just growing. And as I looked at this woman's face, she was an elder. There were tears welling up in her eyes. And it occurred to me that no matter how misguided she was, yes, she was misguided, that her emotive response was real. And this unfair thing that happens to people from a marginalized group that doesn't happen to everybody else happened, where you get asked to be spokesperson for a whole group of people. Like, I got a house full of natives. I don't even know what they're thinking half the time. But anyways, I had to think fast. And I said, ma'am, could you put some clothes on? Because I would love to talk to you about all of this. And she did. And we had a good talk. And, I think she came away with a different perspective and learned a few things, but in a weird way, I did too. I could have titled this book, Lessons from a Naked Stranger in the New Jersey Woods. Nick would be selling copies like crazy. But really, one of the things I learned is that it's important to make safe space, to give people a meaningful answer, not just an angry rebuke. And I ended up giving talks on this. It took me all over the place, and it took me in front of a lot of kids. And so I ended up working on the young reader edition so we could speak directly to young people. And I've been, I don't know how many, dozens and dozens of events just in the past, 6 months or so, in front of lots and lots of kids. And man, they have some good questions. And the questions keep shifting and changing. And so it keeps me searching. And I've just really appreciated the opportunity to grow as well as to share. And so excited for the receipt that the book has had in the academic and in the education universe. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton. Maybe for the 20th anniversary edition, we'll ask that woman to contribute a photograph for the case cover or something.
I tell you, Nick, about 20 years after that happened, someone who was there showed up at one of my book events and was like, I was there. It was just crazy experience. They were totally cool.
All right. Eric, if you don't mind, how about you go next?
Okay, so I tend totally inadvertently in my career to poke the bear at all times. And I kind of never know how it's going to happen. I just know that it is going to happen. I somehow ask the inappropriate question or make the inappropriate statement, no matter what. And so eventually I kind of got to the point of embracing that and saying, well, this is just going to be the way my life, it will execute itself, or I'll get executed one way or the other. And I have been working on numerous projects, and that tends to be how my work goes. It branches out one from another. It's almost like the way in which we grow Indian corn, actually, which is that you end up pulling a kernel, and that becomes the seed of like the next crop. And so much of my work comes that way too. And some of it is quite stream of consciousness. So I had done this play, which was really, really challenging as a piece of work, and had the opportunity to have a staged reading of it at the public theater. And it's like a really remarkable opportunity, and I couldn't even believe the luck I had in that recognition. And so it was it was a very large room full of many, many people and quite a few Indigenous people from around the country. And I'm kind of a smartass in general, but also serious. And so I was listening for where where the jokes landed and where they didn't land, and just essentially what kind of response. It was a great opportunity. A few hundred people kind of test drive your work for the very first time. Terrifying as well. But it was kind of interactive. It had quite a few slides of paintings that I had made. I think it was like 75 paintings. It was not a good plan to write 75 paintings into the work because I didn't really think it was going to be accepted. And so when it was, I had to get hustling. Um, but out of all of this, in this very complex work, the one moment that got a universal tense response was pointing out that apple was a slur in Indigenous communities. And I just heard that like the room's temperature just dropped. Everybody was like, "Rrr," and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I thought, because I really thought there had been things that came earlier that would have elicited a similar response, and they kind of didn't. I mean, people laughed, but that was the one. So immediately I thought, okay, I have to go explore that more fully now. And it turned out I was working on a number of different projects, and a lot of my work has this weird overlap. And I've been kind of doing this ongoing communication with the Beatles work for probably 20 years at this point. And I was interested in realizing that at the time they kind of came into their own for freedom, they created their own record label, and they called it Apple Records. And in fact, that was the Apple I borrowed for all the paintings in this play, because I wanted this kind of beautiful, semi-recognizable apple that some people would have seen before. And I got to thinking that it was very much about being part of a group, but also kind of seeking out your own identity. And I think that's a major relationship that most Indigenous people from communities feel. I think like I grew up around 1,200 people, and I knew a fair number of them. And as I got to be an adult and met students, just from the suburbs in this area, that is not their experience. They might know neighbors in the house next door and maybe two doors down, but they don't know their communities, at least around here. And I thought, oh, okay, so I really did grow up in this very different place. And I kind of wanted to explore what that meant to be raised in a place next to America, but not America. And then ultimately come to the realization that to do what I wanted to do, to become a professional artist in some fashion, I was going to have to make the choice to go to college, get some experience, and that was going to take me further and further away. So it became then really, at this much later stage, a memoir about what it meant to be immersed fully in that community through much of my early life, and then to have to make an explicit decision to change the way I lived on a daily basis. And so that was kind of the origin of the book.
That's beautiful. Thank you. ALR?
Hi. Wow, this is a tough question to answer because I feel like my my book's origin story, there are many places where it came from. So chronologically, the first
Andrea, you're cutting out a little bit. Can you hear us?
Can you guys hear me through the okay, good.
Right.
Much for headphones. So the first story I wrote was that's in this collection I wrote in 2001, and I was working in a library, and it was really the first piece of, I guess, what you would now call speculative fiction. And it was Maria, most likely. And
I wrote that in 2001, and then I just sort of set it aside. And then in about 2004, I moved to Dallas, and the Dallas Public Library had a short story contest. And so I crafted on it some more, worked on it some more, and I entered it in the contest, and it won. And I got a copy of Amy Tan's Saving Fish from Drowning, and it was autographed, and I got a gift certificate for dinner at a really good restaurant there in Dallas. And so that was the first story that I wrote that it went in this collection. But my stories I've always felt like all of the characters are connected. And so when I write, I'm writing about the people I know. I'm writing about the people from my family. I'm writing about the people from my community. So everyone is connected in some way, whether by blood or marriage, whenever I write. And so I worked on a middle grade novel, and I got into the Institute for American Indian Arts low residency program. And I was working full time as a teacher. And so I was doing the program, and I went with the intention of rewriting my middle grade novel as my thesis. And so I got there, and I started writing vampire and werewolf stories instead. And so my mentor the first semester was Manuel Gonzalez, who wrote, let's see, The Regional Office is Under Attack, and then a fabulous collection of short stories, and I can't think of the title. And I said, Manuel, what should I do? Because I have this middle grade book, which I'm sure I can do something with, and with mentorship and attention to craft, I can really make this a great book. I said, but I went home and I started writing werewolf stories. And the werewolf stories I'm writing I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where The Outsiders was published. S.E. Hinton, was 18 when she published it. My dad, that was like the first book he bought me when I was in fourth grade. He always figured he wanted, I wanted to be a writer. He encouraged it. He was hoping I'd, sell something like The Outsiders by the time I was 18. That didn't happen. But when I would read the book, I would always think, this is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. These kids are going to Rogers High School. Where are the Indians? Where are the Cherokee people that I know? How come there are no Indians in this book? And now, having become a writer and realizing some writers have blind spots, I'm actually grateful that we're invisible in there, because it's so hard to do it right? If you don't come from those people, if you haven't held their babies, if you haven't hung out with us, it's really hard to get it right. And so my werewolf story was basically, he's a greaser, because, who were the first greasers really? I mean, they were Native people and Hispanic people living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so my dad was a greaser, right? And so he had the pompadour and the greased back hair and the jeans. And so I wrote a story about a greaser who's a Cherokee and becomes a werewolf, right? And so that was what I was excited about doing. And so then I actually had the title for the book before I wrote the title story for the book, because I just love the title Man-Made Monsters. And I envisioned it when I came up with the title as my Frankenstein story. This was going to be my Frankenstein story. And so as I started writing all these stories that would go in the collection, me and my dad used to watch the Friday night Plenty Scary Movies, right? And so, Friday night I'd stay up late and we would watch The Invisible Man or Dracula. And then, so those were important to me. Those times were important to me. Sitting and watching those with my dad was important to me. That whole feeling of being scared, but also being comfortable, being safe, because I was there in the front room with my father. Nothing was going to happen to me, and I could be a little scared, but I could also know that my dad was right beside me and had my back. So that was how I started putting the stories together. And then we moved to Texas from Tulsa, and I actually knew very little about Native people in Texas. I didn't understand the whole stuff with the border and, the Lipan and what Texas did with Native people. And we went out to visit when I first moved to Dallas, I did know about, I learned, because I was working for the American Indian Ed program, I did learn about the massacre of the Cherokees in Texas, just outside Dallas. And So then I read this book called Conquest of Texas, and I went out to see where my people were killed when they were being forced out of Texas. Several Cherokees had come to Texas prior to being removed from Indian territory. So they worked with Sam Houston. He tried to get us a lease to our land there in Texas. And then we were run out, when we had corn in the fields. We were we tried to stay and it did not work out. And so this book, Conquest of Texas by Gary C. Anderson, Ethnic Cleansing in the Promised Land, I learned more than I wanted to know about the history of the way Native people were almost exterminated. And so, and in learning about that, I also learned about my people, the Cherokees and Chief Bowles. And that is where my vampire character was born. And so Alma ties all these stories together because Alma survives a massacre in 1839. And the most important thing to her, though, is to watch over her family, to make sure that her sister's children grow up, to make sure her sister's grandchildren grow up. And so for 200 years, she pops in and out of this family, just checking in, seeing where they're going, and making sure that they survive, because it was it was a real possibility that Indian people would be exterminated. And so we're 1% to 2% of the population now on land where we formerly were in, the millions. And so here we are. And so that's kind of wrapping up sort of man-made monsters. So.
That was awesome. I think that that's a great lead into my next question, which is, your experience describing like reading The Outsiders. And if you don't mind, I'd love to ask you three, kind of what was your experience with, quote unquote, Native stories as like traditionally published growing up, and how is your work nowadays kind of in dialogue with that?
Well, I guess I wore this for a reason. That we tended to be like extremely invisible, and you just didn't see anything. And I think the reading I did that was kind of acrobatic to even find something like it was I ended up reading novels about small towns in which there were communities. But then I had the tremendous fortune of actually having been a writer from my community right around the time that I was beginning to take reading seriously. And it was a book called The Reservation by this gentleman, Ted Williams. And I started reading it, and it was a book for adults, so it was kind of hard, but it was also engaging and entertaining. And my uncles appear as characters in it, and so there was certainly some allure to that. And seeing them in their much younger years, when they were kind of kids, and that's sort of how the book ends. Is that it's a testimony saying that kind of every generation there should be somebody who has dedicated their lives to telling the stories for the next one that comes along. So I was the next generation that came along, and I thought, okay, maybe I can do that. Maybe I can be that person. There's kind of a lot of hubris in believing that, but ultimately it was a tremendous gift. And then by the time I was 18, Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine came out, and that kind of changed my life, and and really set me on a concrete direction.
Yeah, I just think it's a really exciting time to be engaged in this work. I really want to give a brief appreciation to Nick and everybody else in the team at Levine Querido, because I think they're doing a great job at providing opportunity and amplifying Indigenous voices. If you look just 30 or even 20 years ago, there really weren't that many people out there. And there are so many of us now, and we're all so different. I think you have a range of Indigenous voices, urban, res, people who are back and forth between them, people who are doing work with Indigenous languages, folks from communities that aren't even properly recognized. We're a very diverse group of humans. Some of us look Black, some look brown, some look white, some look racially ambiguous. You have a range of knowledges on language, culture, all kinds of things, and everybody's making some noise. So I think that makes it very exciting. I've really appreciated the opportunity with my work where, like when the made for adults version of Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask came out, there were a whole bunch more questions and new things that happened. And, lots of young reader audiences that wanted to engage with the work. So the opportunity to then, reimagine the entire project and speak directly to them and pull that together was great. And I feel like, my personal evolution and the evolution in, literature for young people is just even emerging. Like there's so much more ahead of us.
I appreciate you saying that, Anton. And, it's Eric, you'll remember another book that we published won this award earlier this year. And we were talking with the author. We were like, is this are you the first Native author to win this award? And we actually had someone like fact check it. And it was like, oh, well, someone, won it in the 70s. And it was like, but it turned out that guy was just like a white dude, like pretending to be Indian, and so like for my, just like perspective, it's like the lack, right? But then also just like the bad representation, right? Which is just as, if not more pernicious. That was certainly my experience growing up and, the books I was given in suburban New Jersey. So.
Yeah, definitely what both Eric and Anton said, absolutely. I had the experience of, my oldest daughter is 25. And so when I went to look for books for her when she was like 3 or 4, most of the stuff out there was not great. People would recommend books to me thinking that they were written by Native authors, and often they weren't. I think Cynthia Lytex Smith's Jingle Dancer had come out, maybe, and Indian Shoes, but that was kind of it, especially being, someone who, we didn't have peyote powwows and teepees. We were not, lots of Cherokees do participate in powwows now, but that's not our traditional dance. And so all the stuff that I knew about was not out there. And here I was, and I was a writer. I wanted to write. I was going to write, the next Outsiders. And then I thought, well, if it's not out there, maybe that's what I need to do. And so I started, kind of working at it a little bit. But it was, part of it was the lack, not seeing things that pertain specifically to my culture. I was in Indian Territory. I can't remember how many tribes are in Oklahoma, but there was a book by Dr. Dwayne Kendall Hale that came out, in the 80s. And he actually he was a Creek man, or he is a Creek man, and but he had been raised in Texas as well with his mom's people, and so he had to sort of reconnect. And part of his reconnection, though, was creating these workshops for Native people and visiting tribes and doing workshops about how to tell your own history, how to save your own language. And in his data, of the 571 federally recognized tribes, the stories of only maybe, there were books like there were many tribes with no stories out there. There were many tribes with no published work out there. And this was in nonfiction too. So, this was like not even theses, not even dissertations, not even nonfiction books. And so with that many tribes, we still have so many stories to tell. And so, and then within each tribe, you have all these different stories within that tribe. Just because you're Cherokee, if you didn't grow up in Tahlequah, maybe you're urban, maybe you grew up in California. The Indian Relocation Act impacted a lot of families. The diaspora, was part of survival. And so there are so many stories to tell. And so I thought, I need to tell mine. I need to tell mine from my point of view, because I'm the only one who can do that.
That's really great, Andrea. And I think that kind of leads into my next question, which was, and kind of answers, which is, exactly that, right? Like there's this, maybe a common misconception or misbelief among non-native people, right? That like all native people are the same, right? Or they're like all these, dominant similarities, where in reality there's hundreds of different tribes, right, across this country and Canada, this continent. But at the same time, would you guys say that there are, like when you're writing and creating art, do you feel links of commonality and as you're going out and publishing, and how do you wrestle with that, right?
One thing I've noticed, I'm taking a native autobiography class, and I'm not, I don't know about Eric and Anton. I think maybe there are some similarities in that, from a cosmological standpoint, with Cherokees, we don't believe that we're above like any other creatures. We were kind of, the creator made us all sort of at the same time. And so there's not a hierarchy of, we're above and supposed to take care of the animals and all that stuff. We're kind of all equal, I guess you would sort of say. I mean, hunting is still fine, but I guess we don't see ourselves. I mean, we're just like another one of the creator's creatures, right? We're just another part of the universe. And so, and the same with, looking at the earth itself and, trying to keep everything in balance. Because once you're out of balance with the earth, then culturally, our belief is that if you're not in balance with the earth, then that throws the community out of balance. And if the body and the individual human being is out of balance, you can't have balance around you. And so it's this cycle of like trying to always maintain some sort of balance. At least, I don't know, that I could be wrong about that, but that's sort of a similarity I see with a lot of indigenous cultures.
That's a great question. To me, although we have 574 federally recognized tribes, you've got, hundreds of other indigenous groups and communities that are not, federally recognized, and the diversity of languages, cultural practices, historic and contemporary, are pretty significant. There are things that are in common too, like, all of us humans are indigenous to somewhere in some way, like we come from somewhere, but indigeneity means connection to place. And so, I find in my experience, like, I don't know, I get to live at home. It's a pretty rare experience for a lot of academics who get to live in their own home community, but my relatives have been buried in the same place longer than America's been a country. And so that makes it a little different to sell the family farm and move to California, and those kind of things. But even for my, for other Native people who maybe have lived in an urban area for 3 generations in a row, there's still a sense of connection to that place, even if it's lived a little differently than some of our ancestors have. So that's definitely a common thread. And we've also had, some parallels in our experiences with, marginalization, treatment with government policies, and have some common interests in validating and affirming tribal sovereignty. Are some common struggles with, at times, feeling hypervisibility. That could be racial profiling, things like that. And also invisibility and marginalization, from being often imagined and infrequently well understood.
I think one of the other things that happened with a later life discovery was that I had largely assumed through much of my life that that most indigenous communities around the country were quite similar, because even the few places I had visited tended to, I guess they looked like identifiable reses, and I thought, okay, yeah, this is pretty similar. And I went along that way, and I had become a professional, and sometime in this century, so post 2000, I had done some work for the ANA, the Administration for Native Americans, doing grant reading, and in the middle of it, they put you up in a hotel, and you have to read these grants and compare them, to the Federal Register, and sort of see how the group has has met the qualifications. And during one of the days, there was a knock at my door, and I answered, and it was one of the program officers. And I thought, oh, geez, have I screwed something up already? Because I hadn't done this before, and it was new to me. And he said, hey, I want to know if I can talk to you for a few minutes. And I said, yeah, sure, of course. And he said, there are only 3 tribes in the entire country who refuse to have a relationship with the BIA and the ANA, and you belong to 2 of them. He said, maybe you could tell us a little bit about that attitude and that choice. And I was blown away by this because I had no idea that that was true. So I had been really curious when I had visited other places. I think I'd already been to Minnesota by then, and I had seen that that there were Indians who were clearly involved in voting, and who were thinking about the 2 parties and so forth in America. And I thought, what are they doing? Like, I really did not understand that they were participants in American government. And that so that was like a weird eye-opening experience for me to learn that as general and as common as I thought our experiences were, I happened to live in a really, really small and isolated community. I had no idea, because most of the Indians I knew well were from these places. And so I thought, okay, well, this is an ongoing experience. But as a writer, I felt that I could only ever truly grasp and successfully document the communities I'm involved with, because the more complex I saw the larger Indigenous world, the more I knew I could never do it justice, and that I was only going to be able to safely represent my place, and probably even just my family in my place. I mean, and I'm sure not all of them would agree that I represented them well. So it's I think the idea of a general Native America is just such a strange notion, even though we do have many things, significantly genocide, in common.
I just want to quickly share the cover for Eric's next book, because that wasn't in the slide, but both Eric and Andrea have books coming out this fall. Hopefully I don't have anything horribly embarrassing on my screen. That sometimes happens.
Oh,
thank you, Eric.
One thing,
Andrea, you got it.
Oh, sorry. One thing I just wanted to add, and Eric and Anton can speak to it themselves, is one thing that we are struggling with as a tribe is trying to recover our language. And I think most tribes have that sort of situation. I mean, there has to be an intentional effort to keep language or to recover language. And so I think that's something that it would surprise me if not almost all tribes in this continent, that's not one of our struggles. And it is important, I know, because in the Cherokee language, our culture is built into the language. And so some of those cultural lessons can be passed down without the language, but you're going to start losing them if you can't get the language recovered.
That was actually my next question. I think both Andrea and Eric, you both kind of your respective languages, and also I think patterns of communication are something that's really woven in really deeply into both of your works. And then Anton, of course, through your work with language, that's a huge part of your book. So I just wondered if you guys could talk a little bit about that and kind of what you were going for with each of your respective books.
Yeah, happy to share a little bit. I'm a fluent speaker of Ojibwe, and I think that every language embodies the unique worldview of a people. It's a critical function of identity. In our way, like we have a word Inwe, which means to make a characteristic sound. So you could say Ani Nainwe Dani Mush, like what sound does a dog make? Ruff ruff. Ani Nainwe Gajagains, meow. Ani Nainwe Dinishinabe. What sound does a native person make? Is it this right here? And so Also, you know, if a language goes, then what happens to identity? What happens to sovereignty? Like if we're assimilated with the ruling class, although there might be legal arguments to make, there's less of a social argument to make for our sovereignty. So a lot of Indigenous people are, you know, working hard on this, and there's some exciting stuff going on. Cherokee is in a similar boat with, you know, Ojibwe, Mohawk, Blackfeet, and some of the others that are showing some real strength with their language revitalization efforts. So, you know, we have immersion schools going for Ojibwe now. We just released Rosetta Stone Year 1 for Ojibwe. You know, Cherokee has all 87 characters for the Cherokee syllabary as an operating system in your iPhone. You can switch over. You know, so this type of work is happening, but it makes a really big difference if you're from a, you know, a tribe like, you know, Cherokee or Navajo Nation with 250,000 members, or if you're a 50-person rancheria in California, in terms of mobilizing the number of humans necessary to build these sorts of things. And some languages are in much more advanced states of decay than other ones. You know, we had over 500 tribal languages spoken just in the US and Canada alone. Pre-contact, we're at about 130 now, of which about 20 are spoken by children. So the interventions are timely, critical, ongoing, and there is some heroic and really exciting work going on. I'd say for my language, the future vitality of that language might not be certain, but it's certainly possible, depending on what we do about it now.
I would say first of all, 3 of my 4 grandparents were sent to boarding schools, 2 to Carlisle and 1 to Hampton. And so when they came home, they made, I mean, I'm fortunate in that they came home, but they made concerted efforts not to speak the language to their children, but their children were growing up in an environment where enough other people were still speaking it that they learned it anyway. But then they chose the same thing, and so so I learned English, and because I was raised at Tuscarora, when I eventually was exposed to some language, it was Tuscarora. It turned out we were having the beginnings of a revitalization program the year before I started kindergarten. So I was fortunate that one of our daily classes from the day I started school was in fact Tuscarora language. And I don't know if it's just because I happen to be a language person, clearly kind of tied, you know, hardwired to it, that I picked it up easily. And so I was I excelled at it back then, but it stopped at the end of 5th grade because I then went into the larger middle school. And so mostly what I've remembered is like a lot of vulgarity and other useful words in the language. And but the people who were all fluent, you know, speakers from birth, they've all passed now. Just recently, within the last 2 years, our last original native speaker passed, and he was in his 90s. But a new generation in all this time, the continuum of my lifetime, has emerged. And ironically, one of my nephews, who's very shy as a person, has, for whatever reason, found himself not shy in language revitalization. And so he's become one of the leaders in that program. And so it is very fluid. But I also noticed that, and certainly my editors have noted for me as well, that my English syntax is super weird, because it relies much more heavily on the orientation of Tuscarora in this as a verb-based language. So my sentences in their original forms are very curiously structured, and I have to kind of make a concerted effort to make them a little bit more accessible as fiction. Poetry is a little bit easier to get away with weird syntax, so I'm, you know, kind of half my career is
Eric,
poetry.
we call that Resi.
Yeah, it's Resi.
Resi is wonderful.
I spent the last 72 hours like watching the NBA playoffs and just going through Eric's copy edit back from the copy editor, and who made some changes to this, and I'm like, stat, like, haven't you gotten it by now? Stat. Yeah.
It's voice. It's voice. Yeah. Let's see. So with Man-Made Monsters, Gosh, I was working on like one of the later stories that occurs chronologically, date wise, one of the stories that's more contemporary to my experience. And and I was remembering reading A Clockwork Orange when I was, about this age that the characters in the stories are, and what was happening in my high school with that, and trying to use the language, with Anthony Burgess with A Clockwork Orange, and he's got Russian. I was reading and I looked some stuff up about A Clockwork Orange, and he said, he wanted people to leave his book knowing some Russian, and I was like, that's what he was doing. So like a lot of his phrases in there, a lot of his stuff is related to Russian and sort of British street, but so you leave that with with the vodka, right? You leave that with some new words that you didn't know before that replace that you can replace your English words with. And so I thought, oh my gosh, that's what I'm going to do. So we're going to replace some English. I had seen a language presentation by one of our councilwomen, Candace Tihi, and she said, every day learn a new word. Instead of saying dog, say geetly from now on. So from now on, I don't say dog, I say geetly, right? And so to just start replacing the English with some Cherokee. And so if you do that every day, you got 365 words at the end of the year, right? And so I went back through and, started putting in more Cherokee because, why not? Why not leave this book with 87 new Cherokee words, right?
Quick shout out to, there's a great illustrator, Jeff Edwards, who did pieces for Andrea's book. And he actually works as a language technologist for the Cherokee Nation, and woven syllabary like everywhere in a really cool way. So, Kia, actually, there were a couple of questions I wanted to get to from the chat. Is that cool, or did you want to jump in?
No, you go.
Okay. Someone asked if you three have any middle grade or young adult recommendations from Native authors that you might suggest. And you're not allowed as much as I would like to recommend each other's books. It has to be something different.
I get this question a lot. And one of the things I did is I just put a tab for resources on my website, and I have a list of Indigenous authored books. And I try to add to it periodically because there's so much stuff coming out. We did put a list of recommended stuff in the back of the Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians, but we're afraid to ask. But as soon as you publish that, then there's a whole bunch of more books that come out. So I keep updating that list, periodically, probably every 6 months or so. I'll add a few more titles, and it's by no means comprehensive, but that's one of the things that I steer people towards, because lots of people are looking. We have been often imagined. You're still more likely to see images of aliens than Indigenous people on TV. And so that's why it's so great that Macken's pulling us all together for a conversation like this, so we can just get a better, more filled out understanding and connect with one another. So I can drop the link back in the chat in a minute too. Yeah, thanks.
All right, so I got Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones. It's sort of middle grade. It's about a werewolf. It's also about being Indian, but the word Indian, I think, is never in there in relation to people. I think there might be an Indian motorcycle. But Mongrels, I love that book. Rain Is Not My Indian Name by Cynthia Lytech Smith. Anything by Cynthia Lytech Smith. Louise Erdrich, please, please, please replace your Little House on the Prairie books with Louise Erdrich's stuff. The Birch Bark House, this series, so good. Illustrations are beautiful. Anyway, and Alatsoi by Darcy Little Badger. Anything by Darcy Little Badger too. So.
I think Andrea stole most of what I would have recommended. But at the same time, I want to say that for the longest time in American book culture, there's kind of one book listed and one name listed. And I think that's what I'm always cautious of, is giving a recommendation of 2 or 3 people and there being 40 others you could find if you did a little bit of work. So, so don't rely upon like that one book you once heard of. and take a little initiative and find us. We are out there.
I would say a real favorite of mine is The Marrow Thieves by Sherry Deameling. That's a really great YA, like kind of dystopian. And then a book, it's an adult book, but I think like if you're like working with kids who are like teenagers who are kind of graduating to adult books, that I think is great for that age is The Roundhouse, by Louise. That's like an absolute classic and just such a great book, coming of age book.
I'd throw out anything by Eden Robinson. It's more high school, but like Monkey Beach or the Trickster series, very coming of age, good stuff.
For sure. Anton, there was a question in there too, which is the first question that you answer in your book, which is like when kind of speaking generally is, do you think there's like one proper term to use? Native, Indigenous, North American Native,
Yeah. What is it? Is it Indian, Native American, Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nation person, or what? Because there's nothing like not knowing what to use to like paralyze a conversation. So it's a great question. And unfortunately, it's not fully settled yet. I would love for us to do what they did in Canada, where they had a national conversation, and through the, representation through the councils of First Nations chiefs, they settled on First Nation. So instead of calling them reserves, they call them First Nations. And instead of Indians or Aboriginals, they call them First Nations people. There are three groupings in Canada. So there's First Nations, Inuit for the Arctic Indigenous folks, and Métis. And here in the US, we haven't gotten there. Some folks have tried to double down on any one or the other. And so I would love for us to do something like that, Native Nation, something. But, the terms like Native and Indigenous, and you'll hear me use them quite a bit, are pretty politically correct, but you still have to establish context, because if you just say Indigenous, that could mean, a Maori person from New Zealand. If you say a Chicago native, is that a Native American from Chicago? Boy, that was a lot of syllables. Or just someone born and bred. You still have to establish context. And then once you do, then those ones work just fine. And then some folks have tried to double down on American Indian just to distinguish from all the others. And because that's the term that has been used in, court cases and things like that. That doesn't mean we have to be wedded to it forever. Of course, Chris Columbus got lost and thought he was in China, no, Japan, no, India, yes, boom, and these are Indians, and it stuck. In spite of its, origins, some Native folks, the American Indian movement, the National Congress of American Indians, and others have tried to double down on that. And I think what's most important, you'll hear me do, I kind of use them all somewhat interchangeably, aware of their shortcomings, mainly as a means of establishing safe space. But what I'll often recommend, because a lot of you are educators, is speak to the folks in your community. Like if you have a Native parent committee, field that question with them. And that'll do two things. One is you will be guided by your local Indigenous stakeholders, and that will empower them and have you in communication with them. And the other thing it'll do is get you a get out of getting beat up around the ears card, because if somebody gives you a hard time, you can say, oh, well, thank you for your feedback. We revisit this conversation on an annual basis. I'll make sure your comments get into the pile. And I have to listen to and empower the Native voices in our community who've told us to use whatever it was you chose,
I have one last question, Kia, if we have time, really quick. All right. I kind of realized like right before, like that all three of you are teachers and, have participated or worked in education. And what's your favorite way to teach a book or work with your students, either in the past or nowadays? And how would what's one piece of advice that you give to teachers and librarians out there, working with kids of this age?
Well, one thing that I've actually done with my college students is like I show up with all my graphic novels and I lay them out and, just let them, and I tell them, you got to spend 5 minutes with something, then put it back. and then, you know, spend 5 minutes with something else. And so the Dallas Holocaust Museum put out this fabulous set called 10 Stages of Genocide. And it's got one called Our Land, which is about the persecution of the Karankawa Indians in Texas. And so a lot of times, sort of, I think graphic novels can be safe spaces to start with kids who might, you know, find something that they're interested in. And so it might speak to, you know, the kid that doesn't want to read, you know, 500 pages right off the bat. But then again, the kid who does want to read 500 pages might also like a graphic novel. So I taught art as well. So I've taught English and art. And so back when I taught in Dallas, I had kids who struggled to write me an essay, but they could do an 8-page comic book, and it would be amazing. And so just allowing kids to express themselves, because it's really all about story. I mean, everything we love is about story. I mean, whether it's a post or a TikTok or whatever, we're a narrative people. All human beings are narrative, and so we're always telling ourselves stories. But allowing children to tell their stories in whatever way they're most comfortable with is what I lean towards.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think I encourage my students, and this is when I'm working with folks at the college level, but also when I'm doing work in K-12, is to see what in that writing, what does that trigger in you? So people aren't just outward facing, where do I get some information, but they're inward looking too. Like, how does this connect with me, with my story? And it opens space where everybody's experiences in humanity is validated, and they can bring themselves into the conversation. That way they're learning about others, but they're also kind of learning about themselves through the process. And it also, you know, makes it safe space for that kind of work where no one's asked to be the content expert, even on their own culture, but all of us can own our own, you know, narrative and experience. And so once you connect with that, everyone's got something to say, and it usually opens up a pretty vibrant conversation.
I tended to begin the semester with an anthology, and in rapid fire assign short stories from a wide variety of writers to just establish that there isn't such a thing as the native lit voice. And so if they're reading in the course of 1 week, you know, 6 or 7 writers who have very distinctly different experiences and you know, vocal rhythms, that begins with the that's like the base platform for the rest of the semester to sort of get them to understand that native lit as the, you know, as the title of the course is a little bit of a misnomer, and that really it should be native literatures, because it's going to be all of this wide variety of different voices. I did learn something really weird a couple of years ago. Again, one of the accidental teaching things. I was giving a talk at the Onondaga Nation School, but I was supposed to be talking only to the 7th and 8th graders. And I was okay with that. And I was, you know, dealing with If I Ever Get Out of Here, which is a novel that takes place in middle school. And I thought, okay, I don't really deal with younger kids very often, but I'll try. And but at the last minute, they told me I was speaking to the entire elementary school. And I thought, oh, you know, are kindergartners ready for this story? And I thought, you know, I'm going to give them a shot, because I started reading early, and I started reading in as dramatic a voice as I can, the first chapter, and like these little kindergarten and first grade kids were like totally absorbed with it. And I guess I had to learn to respect them and their ability to listen to a story. Like, it was sort of frightening how intense their stare was, and it then got to be very comforting, because I don't really see myself as somebody who chats with 6-year-olds very often.
I think that's a great note to end on. Trust the kids, trust the readers.
Okay, everyone. Well, as you can see in the chat, everyone has been loving this. This was such a great conversation. And so we thank you all so much for taking the time to be here with us and engage in this conversation. It's just a plug for next month's webinar coming up on May 3rd about the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, Heritage Month. All right, well, then we will send you off with a little thank you video, and we appreciate everyone being here with us today.